Spring it on with 40 to 70% off almost everything at Gap Factory and gapfactory.com. Matching styles for the family are on sale too. Shop it all through April 12th.
Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LA Football Network. We are continuing, once again, our training camp positional battle. Dan, we only have 15 days until training camp is back. It's just that next indication that football is that much closer, even though it still feels like it's eternity away. But we're 15 days away from Chargers training camp. So we're going to get into all of that as it relates to the cornerback position. But Dan, you have a short little announcement, don't you?
Yeah, short little announcement. Before we go any further, this episode is brought to you by our good friends over at Manscaped. You can use the code LAFB20, save 20% on all of your male grooming needs, from the Lawnmower 4.0, you know the spiel. They have all kinds of stuff to make you feel better, more confident in and outside of the bedroom. And honestly, it's for anyone that you could think of. Go to manscaped.com, use the code LAFB20, save 20% and free shipping. Again, LAFB20, free shipping and 20%. For those of you coming into the show for the first time, thank you so much for joining us and welcome. You're in for a treat. We're going to have a blast. You can follow us everywhere, subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, podcasts, you name it. But without further ado, Jake, let's get this show on the road and talk about all things cornerback.
Cornerback.
You know how many times we've done interviews with folks, we've made that mistake?
Yeah, you really have to
quarterback.
Enunciate. Yeah, you really have to enunciate, when it comes to that. So yes, as it relates to the cornerback position, you talk about a position group that has, I don't want to say it's not, turnover is not necessarily the right word, because yes, there's some players that were here last year that are no longer here. So I guess to the certain viewers, you'd say upgrade. Certain viewers, you would say turnover. I don't know, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, there's just been a lot of change for this position group over the last year. You have Casey Hayward, who's no longer here, who was the number one cornerback for a good period of time with this team. He's now playing with the Raiders. You bring back Michael Davis in free agency. You sign Asante Samuel Jr. with your second round pick in the 2021 draft, but you still have some talent beyond those three big names. So if I was to pick one that I would want to start with, I'd probably say that I want to start with Michael Davis, because this was a guy that, Dan, as it got closer to free agency, we actually weren't sure if he was coming back or not. He had a couple of cryptic tweets that were out there. You didn't know if it was happening. We were even trying to find stuff on the back end through Fernando, and Fernando was even skeptical of whether or not that he was going to be coming back. Again, this was another one of those guys that when it came to the free agency market and when you were talking about priorities, he was definitely up there with the Hunter Henrys of the world, because you knew that if you, at that point in time, you also had let Casey Hayward walk because of his contract, his cap hit. So you let him walk, and you knew at that point you cannot be realistically going into 2021 without Casey Hayward and without Michael Davis. So, of course, the Chargers made it one of their top priorities of the free agent period, and they ended up signing him back. And Michael Davis has had an interesting career. And I think in some situations, has faced a fair amount of criticism just based off of his play. Some people, you're kind of all over the place for what you feel about him. But during his entire tenure with the Chargers, he has progressively improved. And again, we're talking about one of the bigger cornerbacks that's in this group on this team, one of the faster cornerbacks in this group. If you're looking for someone to cover Tyreek Hill, this is going to be your best option as it stands on the team right now. I like the way that he plays. I think the way that Staley and Renaldo Hill is going to implement him from a defensive scheme. Can you just imagine from what Brandon Staley had with the Los Angeles Rams? from having a guy like Jalen Ramsey and other guys like Troy Hill and the guys that he developed through that secondary. Because Jalen Ramsey, as good as that secondary was, he was the only first-round pick that was out of that secondary. You look at the rest of those guys, they were third round and beyond. So Brandon Staley has done a good job, even in a single year, as far as developing mid-draft level talent to play really well. And obviously it showed, because some of the top players from that secondary went on to sign huge free agent contracts with other teams. But yeah, as far as Michael Davis goes, Dan, I really am excited to see how he's going to be utilized in this scheme. Again, we talked about Gus Bradley ad nauseum, not to get down any further, but I think especially when it came to his secondary schemes and what he wanted to do, everything revolved around Derwin James. And when he didn't have Derwin James as his chess piece, I don't think he really knew what to do with the rest of the secondary and put them in the right position to be successful.
No, and you said a lot there with Michael Davis, but I think that last point, I think, is probably where I want to start with this cornerback group. And then I'll get back to Michael Davis for a second. I think it was pretty glaring when we saw this past season with Gus Bradley, or at least the last few seasons, the inability to dynamically change and to adapt was not their strong suit. I think you saw a lot of that specifically in the secondary. And you've heard player after player talking about some of the benefits of a Renaldo Hill or a Brandon Staley-led defenses. And more importantly than anything is that they make they make offenses feel uncomfortable and make them do things that they're not really used to doing. And so I think like the art of a defensive scheme, I think, is going to be where we're going to see the biggest impact and changes across the entire secondary. I think we'll talk about this in a minute, but Chris Harris talked about the ability to be able to play with a coach like a Renaldo Hill, who has been in the league for 10 years and has made plays as a defensive player. So he knows from experience what makes offenses uncomfortable. So from a coaching perspective, going from Gus Bradley to Renaldo Hill / Brandon Staley, I think, is going to be the biggest effect of this cornerback group, by and large, by far, more than any player that we're talking about today. Now, that being said, you've heard Brandon Staley talk about Michael Davis, or Vato. Everybody talks about him and the way he says his name, which I happen to love. Chargers are blessed to have been able to sign him. Everyone talks about his best games are ahead of him. He is, like you mentioned, he is versatile. He is speedy. I think he's one of the faster corners in the league. Last year, career high 14 pass breakups. I think 3 interceptions, if I remember right. I think he's going to do very well on the outside in this cornerback group. And I think one thing you'll start to see is, we talked about it in other position groups when we did this for the interior defensive line. We also did this for, who else did we do this for? What was the second one? I'm terrible with this at this point.
Talking about the positional groups.
Yeah,
we went interior defensive line, and then we did tight ends last week.
Tight ends, there we go. So there are many corners on this group that are here that have very specific traits that they're very good at. Michael Davis, length, speed, coverage abilities. And one of his biggest weaknesses in the past was he couldn't turn his head around. He has actually gotten better at that. He has progressed year over year. Michael Davis is going to be our surefire outside corner along the boundaries, along sidelines, and going against the speedy playmakers and the big playmakers. That is a Michael Davis role. I think he's going to look good this year. I'm not really worried about Michael Davis. I think his floor is like a solid cornerback 2 with the potential of being a mid-level CB1.
Yeah, I mean, he has that potential, like you mentioned. I mean, he's only 26 years old, and last year put up the best year since he's been in the league. And you had already talked about the 14 passes defended and the 3 interceptions. Add on the 64 tackles on top of that as well. I just think that as far as everybody used to talk about Gus Bradley's scheme where he liked the bigger cornerbacks that you could use in that, that Derwin James was like the Cam Chancellor of the defense, and he was always savvy to those bigger defensive backs to play. And you felt like Michael Davis could have grown into something like that if Gus Bradley had employed the right scheme. I think from just everything that we've heard thus far from Brandon Staley, and as you mentioned, Dan, he talks about Michael Davis a lot. I think that he has a high priority for him to exceed, take advantage of that speed and athleticism and that versatility while he has it now, while he's in a great prime of his career. And now look at the rest of the group that you've assembled around him on top of that. So I think that the schemes are going to be a lot better for this team, as Chris Harris likes to tell us. It's going to allow us to play more free. And that's just the message that we keep hearing from multiple players as training camp gets closer. So I think this is going to be a huge benefit for him. And like you said, Dan, especially when you have some of the top, fastest premier receivers, Michael Davis most likely is going to be the guy that is covering them.
So for as much as we talk about Michael Davis being kind of like the athletic traits that I think folks are really excited about, I think Chris Harris Jr. is someone that brings a lot of the cerebral and the mental aspect of the game that I think this team is desperately needing. And it's going to be kind of an extension of a Brandon Staley and Renaldo Hill. You heard Chris Harris, he talked about it on our show, how excited he is to play in this scheme, how comfortable he is in this scheme. He's played with Brandon Staley before back in Denver. And he gets to kind of go back to what he does best. He gets to play man-to-man in the slot, kind of in the middle of the field. And it's going to be kind of fun because he's probably, we hear a lot of the term multiple, which is basically like the defense is going to be showing as if it's doing one thing but doing something else. And so it's going to be looking differently than it actually is at the start of the play. You're going to look and see Chris Harris looking like he's playing zone, looking like he's playing man, looking like he's playing back in coverage or up front of the line. It's going to be fun to kind of watch him. And he was one of the guys that we have heard this coaching staff talk about being positionless. So granted, we are mostly going to see him in the middle in the slot, but I don't necessarily think we're going to just see him as a slot corner. I think we'll see him we'll see him at safety sometimes. I think we'll see him on the outside, sometimes inside. But the majority, I would say, is going to be in the slot and in the middle of the field.
I would hope that I get it. And I'm interested to see how that term positionless is carried out throughout the year. For Chris Harris, he's always been known since he's been in the league as one of the best slot defenders in the league. And even when the Chargers signed him last year in free agency, this is back when they still had Desmond King on their roster, who was their, it was their slot guy at the time. So everybody was confused. It's like, okay, well, where are you going to put Chris Harris? Because you still have Casey Hayward, you still have Michael Davis. Are you going to play him inside? Or are you going to play him outside? I still think just the way that the wide receivers are now, you're not going to put Chris Harris against one of the faster guys in the league.
This coaching staff won't.
No, I would hope not. Close friend in Denver had told me when the signing first happened, had said, if you guys do not keep him on the inside where he, makes his money, where he does his good work, because apparently the last couple of years in Denver when he was there, they tried transitioning him on the outside, and apparently it didn't work so well. So you mentioned the aspects of safety. I'd be interested to see what packages would have Chris Harris in the safety spot. And I know for Chris Harris joining this team last year, it wasn't exactly the free agent impact that we were all hoping. Only totaled 37 tackles, 2 passes defended, and an interception. And he had also missed, I believe it was 7 games with an injury.
Injury, yeah.
Yeah, it is what it is. It's part of the game. Unfortunately, you get some of these injuries that hamper you for good portions of the season. But I think Staley, knowing what that Denver defense was during his time there, I think he's going to put Harris where A, he can play the best of his skill set, B, be more comfortable. And I just think that slot defender for him is where that leadership is really needed right now in the middle of the field, especially when you see the way that certain teams attack Chargers. You could take, Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. They can attack you in a multitude of ways, but the Chargers just always seem to be gashed up the middle. It seems like there's
100%.
There's zero coverage. And whether we're talking about the coverage from the DBs or we're talking about the coverage from the linebackers, last year just looked really bad.
Just very soft.
Really,
like
really
if I had to describe it, it would just be very soft. Like it's very passive. We let everything go in front of us, but there really wasn't much aggression to stop that.
Right. Hence a new defensive coordinator.
So right. To speak. That's why we're here.
New defensive coordinator. That's why we're talking about this. So I'm interested to hear what that quote exactly means, Dan. Positionless for Chris Harris. Do I believe that he's versatile? Absolutely. We've seen it. How much success will he have in being this positionless player? And, I'm not sure. You're going to shift him to the inside, to the outside, because Asante Samuel Jr., I think, is a guy who you can do that with, given his age and his fluidity and his speed. I think that he's a guy who you can do that with. At this point in Chris Harris's career, I think the best spot for him is truly the slot. But hey, I'm interested at this point. This coaching staff has me believing. So again, like I said, I'm interested to hear what this term means when I see it on the field.
Yep. So we've talked about Chris Harris Jr. We've talked about him and his kind of like cerebralness and bringing that leadership. We talked about Michael Davis, kind of his instincts, and not necessarily instincts, but more so just athleticism and kind of that length and speed, which is his kind of claim to fame. Maybe the next guy we talk about is Asante Samuel Jr. And I think his claim to fame, or the thing that he brings to this group, is just instincts. And as much as Michael Davis is fast, Asante Samuel Jr. is quick. So you're not going to see folks kind of jumping quickly from him. Thank goodness he fell into our laps again at number 47 in the second round this year. Everyone talked about how much of a perfect fit he was for what Brandon Staley and Renaldo Hill are looking to do with his defense. He is a bit smaller, so some folks questioned if he could play on the outside.
Size be damned, baby.
Don't ask him that. Nope. So Asante Samuel Jr., I think, is going to end up being the other outside corner, but you'll see, I think, him and Chris Harris kind of swapping roles every now and then. And I think we're going to see Brandon Facyson probably more than folks realize. But the good news about Asante Samuel Jr. is he's a rookie. The guy has so many good instincts, such good pedigree, very versatile, can play anywhere on the field. And I think he's going to learn a ton from, not only, obviously everybody talks about him and Derwin James, but I think he's also going to learn a ton from Chris Harris Jr. And Chris Harris also talked about, the last time we talked to him, how quickly this group has started picking up this defense. And I can't wait to see what a defense with Asante Samuel Jr., Chris Harris Jr., and Michael Davis looks like, because all three are very different football players, but all three have very specific traits that they bring to a team. And it's just it's like the Swiss Army knife that Brandon Staley has, where he has all of these different tools that he could use when he wants them. It's just a matter of how and where he wants to deploy them.
It's an interesting point you just made there, Dan. And I think it's actually a great example of the type of pieces that Brandon Staley has to play with. Because when you really, the exception may be one or two guys, you look at this cornerback group, and they're all very different style of players, whether we're talking size, whether we're talking, versatility, speed, whatever it may be. There's these three main guys that we've just gone over right now. We're about to get into Asante Samuel Jr., but these top three are very different players. But if we just need a refresher course, if anybody needs a refresher course as far as what Asante Samuel did, just to hear it again and make yourself feel good for his 31 games that he played in Florida State, 97 tackles, 29 passes defended, and 4 interceptions. And this is for a guy who sits 5'10", size be damned. as you
on
mentioned,
a Florida State team that was not good.
His instincts to the ball, as you mentioned, Dan, his quickness, his change of direction, his speed. I love the way that he plays, just, much like his dad was. He has those type of playmaking abilities, and to me, just plays like a dog. Doesn't give a damn that he's 5'10", one of the smallest guys on the defense. There have been a small handful of guys in the history of the NFL, when you're talking about secondary players, that thrived around the size that Asante Samuel Jr. is. And as the league went on and people got bigger, you always started, that size comparison always kind of took a little bit more weight on, especially when it came to either wide receivers or defensive backs. Asante Samuel Jr. is one of the exceptions to these rules. So I just think that the way that he plays and what Staley has already implemented, Dan, as you had mentioned, from what Chris Harris has been saying about him, I'm not even sure if you happen to notice, Dan, but did you see who Asante Samuel Jr. has been practicing with? I think this actually just dropped yesterday, I believe.
Was one of them Anthony Schwartz?
It was not. But it was a actually, there were a couple wide receivers. Jalen Waddle. Pretty good.
Who's the other one? There's one more.
Elijah Moore.
That's what I was thinking. It was the same type of archetype. Yes.
And nice to know that he was also practicing alongside Patrick Surtain Jr., albeit for the opposite Denver Broncos. But yes, Patrick Surtain.
Yes, Asante Samuel Jr., I cannot wait to see play. For those who have not seen it, we actually had an opportunity. Thank you so much. Shout out to Asante. He came out of the show, special guest. And Jake, within 30 seconds of us talking with him, I knew the guy just wants to play. Like, he loves being on the field, and he grew up in this environment all throughout his life. And his dad showed him so much of what he does. He's better than his dad was at this age. So I can't wait to see what he does. I can't wait to see what he brings to this team. He was probably the perfect fit for Brandon Staley, other than maybe like if we were going to go over like a Patrick Surtain or maybe a Farley or Horn. But when you get Slater, you're not getting him. This is the next best option for this team, and they struck gold. So this quarterback group looks great from a 1, 2, 3 perspective. Now getting into 4, 5, and we'll talk about kind of the ramifications and how we feel about the position as a whole. How are you feeling about Brandon Facyson this year? Like, do you feel you've seen enough? Do you have questions? Like, where do you see him fitting?
He's been in that reserve role for, this will be his third season coming up, and he's been in a reserve role ever since. And unfortunately for him, when he has seen the field, the opposing quarterbacks have taken notice to that. Because when he's on the field, whether it be for an injury situation or whatever it was, you would see balls being thrown his direction very frequently. And more often than not, unfortunately, he came out on the receiving end of, some bad play from his end for whatever it may have been, whether it's coverage, tackling, whatever. And this is interesting because the Chargers actually, they released him and then ended up bringing him back. I want to say it was mid-March. I think it was around like March 20th, because from what the coaching staff had said, they liked what they saw from him in a very small, very limited amount of playing time that he got in 2020. But again, you look at these intangibles here. One, he's still, regardless of everything I just said, he still is one of the bigger defensive backs as part of this group. He's 6'2", just under 200 pounds. So he's got the size, he has the length, and he's technically now he's one of the veterans of this cornerback group. So I think as it stands right now, I don't think that he gets past the reserve role that he's been relegated to over the last 3 years. But if you can develop him properly, I don't see how I mean, obviously, I don't expect him to get any worse. And if you put him with this coaching staff, to where if you can combine these physical attributes that he has and refine his playmaking ability and his talent, do some tweaks here and there. He just hasn't gotten that opportunity to put it all together yet. He just hasn't done it. But does he have the potential to do it? With this coaching staff, yeah, I believe he does. Does it go to the starter mentality? No, let's pump the brakes on that. But as a key reserve, I think that he can improve, and I think that he can play better and be more successful.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, and you see a lot of times in, like, I don't know, video games, or you hear about, like, when a certain coach is around players, then certain traits they have are either improved or diminished a bit. It's really interesting how us covering the team, you hear players talk about it, you hear folks out in the media, fans everywhere on Twitter, like, everyone seemingly just gives like a +2 grade in every category of any defensive trait because of this coaching staff, without even seeing the coaching staff and this team play one snap. So, and I'm on that boat too. And I think all of us see the potential, but I just find it interesting, especially on defense. Everyone is just like gushing and waiting for the fruits to finally bear of what this defense and the secondary can do with the right coaching. I don't want to say better coaching, but with like the more appropriate coaching for what they need at this current time.
Because I guess appropriate is the appropriate word. But to your point on that, Dan, why is everybody so excited? Well, sometimes the stats don't lie. I know that they may not tell the full picture, but when you look at the stats that were put up from this defense over the past 2 years, and that's a comparable term because of the fact that you didn't have Derwin James for a majority of both of those seasons. He came back late in 2019, but didn't really have that much of an impact at that point in time. So when you see 2 full seasons to where Derwin James did not play a majority of those snaps, and you saw what this defense did, I think that those numbers don't lie. How many times did we have to scream at Gus Bradley on the TV, at the TV for the 2020 season?
Too many.
Exactly. But then you see what Brandon Staley has done in his several tenures, from Denver to Chicago to most recently the Rams. And like I said earlier, look what he's done with talent that was not first round for that secondary. And
I totally agree.
Into it. So that's where you're getting a lot of this excitement from. So, and everything that you've heard, and even the practice schemes that Brandon Staley's been doing by doing 2 fields and basically having everybody practice simultaneously to get the most reps possible. Yes, does it maybe seem like it's getting close to that, over excitement for things that we haven't even seen on the field yet? Yeah, just about that, but still, like you hear these things from Brandon Staley, and it. He could
I'm
sell.
not saying it's not justified.
He could sell car insurance to a giraffe. That's what he makes me believe that he could do. So I'm a believer in it. I like the staff that he's brought in for this, and it's
insurance to a giraffe.
Hey, what are you gonna do, man? It's just he definitely talks to you and puts you in a good mind to believe. That's all. So
okay,
we'll see.
So
that one got you a little bit.
Yeah, I'm a little flustered. So I think where I get a little nervous, and this is a weird kind of shift in roles here. It's at first glance, the cornerback group seems light. And there doesn't seem to be much depth. Like, even Ryan Smith, who we'll talk about in a second, I don't think anyone is expecting him to come onto this team and show a big impact as a corner. Like, I think everyone knows he's coming in because he's great with special teams, and that's something that we are terrible or have been terrible at for a long time. So I'm a little nervous about just like the sheer depth of the cornerback position. Now, I know Brandon Staley has talked about like there's just secondary players, and if you want to technically call them corners, whatever. And sure, some of the safeties can kind of interchangeably become corners. I just have a hard time believing that they're going to go into the season starting week 1 without getting someone else to come out of this roster.
I mean, we could say the same about the safety position, and I get why you say that, Dan, because you talk about the top 3 guys, and then I was just talking about Brandon Facyson right now, and us knowing, especially the way that the football gods love to shame Chargers and Charger fans on a consistent annual basis with that word that I'm not going to use right now because I'm not even going to put it out in the universe, but you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, it does make you a little bit uneasy, a little bit skeptical, but at the same time, we still have a lot of time between now and the first regular game of the season, which means that there are going to be some surprise releases. Who you're going to give up, who you're going to possibly give an opportunity to if one becomes
on other
available.
teams just as much as ours. Yeah,
exactly. So there still is that opportunity there. You can't obviously predict these things right now, but I do get what you're saying as far as just depth goes. Last year, when you had Casey, I guess on paper, you could probably say when you had Casey Hayward, Michael Davis, Chris Harris Jr., and Desmond King, you could say that on paper your depth was better.
Yeah, because then like Facyson then becomes like your 5th best on your depth chart.
Your depth at that time on paper was arguably better. Now, I think your talent is better on your top 3 corners, but your depth has weakened a little bit. So, yeah, I understand exactly what you're saying, Dan.
It is a little nerve-wracking. Like, I am putting all of my faith, and we all are, putting our faith in Brandon Staley, Renaldo Hill. But if it wasn't him, and for example, let's say we were looking like a Brian Dable was our head coach, and we were trotting out Asante Samuel Jr., Chris Harris Jr., and Michael Davis. Like, I don't think Chargers world would be comfortable.
I wouldn't necessarily say that they would feel uncomfortable. You would obviously expect change. Again, it's hard to create those hypotheticals, especially now, because even if you put Brian Dable there, so who would have been your defensive coordinator if he ends up coming over? You just don't know. I would think that your level of optimism may have not be as high as it is now, especially when you hear some of these comments from coaches and players alike. So it's an interesting thought. And I get what you're saying. I don't think that we would have necessarily felt less optimistic. Well, maybe that is what it would be. Maybe we would feel less optimistic if we hadn't heard those things, but I don't think that you'd necessarily feel uneasy if the same exact player transactions ended up taking place, albeit with a different coach.
I feel like Brandon Staley kind of gives us that like safety net where like, okay, Facyson might need some help and we might need some more stuff. Asante, he's a rookie and all that, but Brandon Staley is that good of a head coach and his track record showcases that he can do that. I think there would just be more concern, more angst of the unknown if it wasn't Brandon Staley, which I'm glad it is. Like, we don't have to talk about it. But I think just looking at the personnel by itself, the secondary, specifically the cornerback room, I feel like could use another piece. Maybe just as an insurance policy, not that needs to compete for this first, second, third roster spot. Like, that's not what I'm looking for. So Ryan Smith, we haven't talked about him yet. I don't know how much we're going to see of him in the secondary unit come 2021 for this season. He's what? I think he's the only other person in the secondary with a Super Bowl title. I don't know how many on the defense has one. I mean, do you see, like, how much do you see him impacting the defense? I guess maybe that's the question.
I mean, not much. And you teased it already. Ryan Smith is known for more of his special teams capabilities. If Ryan Smith ends up being the new gunner for this special teams unit, then to me, he's already surpassed his value. Because, hey, you go and watch. Now, do I say that he's the next coming of Kasim Osgood? No, I don't.
Whoa.
But your special teams unit, again, much like a lot of different units that played last year, more specifically on the offensive line, it can't get any worse. It can't get any worse for the special teams unit. So you look at what he's done over the past 5 years that he spent in Tampa Bay. He was brought in specifically to be a key addition to that special teams unit. Last year, played in all 16 games. 78, if I'm right, 78% of the special team snaps. And he had, take it for what it is, but it was still a team high of 7 stops on special teams. Any type of juice that anybody could give me for a special teams guy like
Something's
that,
better.
regardless of what position he may play offensively or defensive, hey, I will take it. So if Ryan Smith is being seen on the defensive side of the ball, then something has gone drastically wrong in the football with the football gods and with this team again. So I hope the only time that I see Ryan Smith making plays is on special teams.
Yep. And then kind of closing this one out, we've talked about each of the players, where we see them playing. What I can't wait to freaking see with this Chargers defense is, like, we're about to see some corner blitzes. Like, we're about to see Chris Harris Jr. in the backfield. Like, I guarantee you, Asante Samuel Jr. will be going after the quarterback at some point this season. Like,
it'll be nice to see that again.
We have gone so long without seeing anything that resembles, like, aggression from the defensive side other than our defensive line. And even that sometimes didn't show up. Anything else on this defense has been literally prevent defense the entire time. And cover 2 would just hope everything stays in front of you. Like, we feel so good to see a defense take calculated risks and, like, the smart risks, not just, like, taking bad angles. Like, there's a different level of risk here that you need to take. And being multiple, I think you're going to see that a lot in the cornerback group. You're going to see them disguise things differently. It'll look like Michael Davis is playing slot all of a sudden on the outside, or vice versa. Chris Harris Jr. is going to look like he's playing slot all of a sudden into the backfield. Like, that's what I'm excited to see. Like, I'm excited to see a team, and the players have talked about it. I'm excited to see a group who is excited to play their position because they know they get to showcase and do something different. Like, you can't underestimate how important that is. I mean, think about it, Jake. Like, if you and I went to the same job, 9 to 5 every day, did the exact same thing, you kept not really performing well, then you go in the next week. Like, at some point, that wears on you. Like, you might be getting paid well, but, like, your morale isn't feeling good. You're not excited to wake up in the morning, go to the gym, and go into work. Mm-hmm. Like, now, I have never seen a Chargers team, like, especially player-wise, this excited for a coaching scheme than this year. And so that's what I'm excited for. Like, just, like, to see something new, refreshing, change, watching this team have fun. It just didn't seem like the team had fun that much last year.
Nope.
At least on defense.
No. Like I said, dude, car insurance to a giraffe, man. He's got everybody bought into it, but you love what's, the talk that's coming out from both coach and players alike, having fun. I think, as you said, Dan, to play their position, I would go a step further and say, play the position that they want or how they want to play it. I think that's what they're excited for.
Good point. That's a good point. So that is going to do it for the cornerback breakdown. Now we're going to get into all other positions, or most other positions. We're going to be talking about the safety position. We'll be talking about inside, outside linebackers, as well as we get closer and closer to training camp. We got a ton of fun stuff in store for Chargers fans this week. Maybe a couple special guests. Tease. But Jake, it's been kind of a crazy last few days. I don't know if you heard, I got locked in a gym last night.
I did. Well, I was one of the first people you called. So yeah, I heard about it.
Yeah, I tried FaceTiming you. You didn't even answer. I'm like, what do I do, Jake? somehow stuck.
And then I saw your tweet that you put out about it, and I was like, "Oh my god, he's locked in a gym."
You just sat there laughing at me, I'm sure.
Oh, I did. So did my wife.
So did everybody, I'm sure, myself included. I'm thinking it's time for a Brewery X to kind of make us feel a little bit better. Brewery X out of Anaheim. We've talked about it a million times. They have all kinds of seltzers, beers. Apparently, they're really well known for pizza, which I can't wait to actually try when I can lose enough pounds to be able to cheat and have one. Given how crazy this weekend has been, and last night has been, and today has been, what Brewery X beverage encapsulates how you're feeling?
Encapsulates how I'm feeling. That would probably be the painkiller seltzer. Yes. Again, 10%. 10%. They'll do it to you. They'll kill your pain. They'll just get, the only thing is they'll give you a whole different pain the very next day if you drink
the next day.
Yeah, the next day.
Cool. All right. Well, again, this is Chargers Unleashed. You can find us on Twitter at LAC_Unleashed. The lovely, the beautiful, handsome Jake Hefner at Jake T. Hefner. Myself at Chargers Homer. We like to make Jake as uncomfortable as we possibly can. But until then, we will talk to you next time on Chargers Unleashed.